I've run more than 50,000 kilometers in the last 12 years, been a part of the world elite in triathlon, and I've trained dozens of runners in everything from training strategies to running form. Over the years, I've picked up 5 essential strategies that are game changers if you want to run fast and injury-free. But perhaps more important, I learned some things that you need to avoid. And believe me, there are a lot of things in the running world you want to avoid. When I first started running, I went online to find the best training plan I could by someone who had run fast themselves. Then I started following that program and got some advice from other runners in my community. And while that set me on a better path than most runners who just go out there with no plan whatsoever, it wasn't until I started using research and experimentation that my speed started to skyrocket. Don't get me wrong, science is not the end-all, be-all, but it's just a great place to start. From here, you need to experiment with different things to find out exactly what works for you, what makes you better, and what makes you worse. So to help you take advantage of what science has to offer, let me share with you my secret weapon that I've been using for years, and I just wish I knew about it sooner. It's one of those things that separates great runners from just recreational runners. But to really take advantage of this principle, you need to learn about something called lactate. Yeah, I know it's not the sexiest thing in the world, but stick with me here, we'll keep it simple. Think of lactate as a molecule you create more and more of the more you train. When you start to run faster, at some point you'll start to make more lactate, and when it starts to accumulate in the blood, it's called the first lactate threshold, or LT1. Then you train even harder, and at some point the amount of lactate in your blood will start to make a steep incline in your blood like this. When it does that, it's called the second lactate threshold, or LT2. See how LT1 and LT2 divides our training into 3 different zones. Zone 1, which is before the first lactate threshold. Zone 2, which is between LT1 and LT2. And Zone 3, which is above the second lactate threshold. This is something the pros use to structure their training to become so much faster, and I'll show you exactly how in a moment. But if you don't have access to measuring lactate, like most normal people don't, then here's how you can look at it from a heart rate perspective. Zone 1 is roughly the same as below 70% of max heart rate. Zone 2 is between 70 to 90% of max heart rate, and Zone 3 is above 90% of max heart rate. You could also think of it as easy, medium, and hard. Be aware that some coaches use a 5-zone or even a 7-zone system, where Zone 2 is something completely different. But for simplicity's sake, we just stick with 3 zones. Now that we know about these training zones, how do we use it to our advantage? Or put another way, how much time should we spend in each zone? That's where something I call the training triad comes in. You see, science has proven time and time again that just mixing up your workouts is not nearly as effective as using one of the following 3 legs in the training triad. So if we want to maximize the time we spend training, we need to do this. The first leg is called pyramidal training. When we follow this type of training, we spend 80% of our training time in Zone 1, 15% in Zone 2, and 5% in Zone 3. The second way to structure our training is called polarized training. This method has gained a ton of traction over the years, and it's also known as the 80-20 method. But since it's impossible to go straight from Zone 1 to Zone 3, it looks more like this. You spend 80% of your time in Zone 1, 5% in Zone 2, and 15% in Zone 3. Finally, the third leg is called threshold training, and the Ingebrigtsen brothers has made this so popular that people are referring to it as the Norwegian method. With threshold training, or the Norwegian method, you spend around 50 to 60% in Zone 1, at least 35% in Zone 2, as close to LT2 as possible, and 0 to 5% in Zone 3. The argument for this type of training is that you can spend more time in race pace without getting the same systematic fatigue. Or simply put, you could run faster without getting so tired. So instead of doing, let's say, 10K all out where you get into Zone 3, you'll do 10 times 1,000 meters with a short break to make sure that you stay in Zone 2. You would do the same total amount of work at that pace, but your heart rate and your lactate levels will be lower. But even though I started using periodization protocols, I would soon learn my next lesson, and I wish I knew about it sooner because it led to my first injury. When I started running, like every runner, I ran into the nearest sporting goods stores to get myself a pair of great running shoes. And when I say great, I mean the ones that looked the coolest. Then I started to use these shoes in every training. When they wore down, I would buy a new set of shoes and then I'd just keep going like that. But I wish I knew sooner that there are 3 big problems with this approach. The first one is that using the same pair of running shoes in every run is a surefire way to get injured. You see, science has shown that the #1 predictor of injury is doing what's called overuse, meaning we do the same movement over and over again. By switching up your shoes, you make small adjustments which helps you prevent that. The second thing is that if you really enjoy a pair of running shoes, then you need to buy multiple. You see, new iterations of that shoe will be a bit different, and over time they will be completely different from the shoes that you fell in love with. So next year or in 2 years, you'll probably have a hard time getting those exact shoes again. So whenever I find a pair that I really enjoy, I make sure to buy multiple. And the last reason is that running shoes are designed for different purposes. Ideally, you would have a pair for trail runs, tempo runs, race, and long distance runs. But even though having multiple pairs of running shoes will make you look cooler, it won't really help you reach your goals. So that begs the question, what does? When I started doing triathlon, I set myself a goal that was 8 years later of going to the Olympics. Many of the athletes I trained with thought that I was insane setting goals that were so far into the future. I mean, most people can't even get through the first month of the year without giving up on their New Year's resolutions. But what they failed to realize was that this was not my first goal. You see, just like you can train your muscles to handle more load, you can also train your mind to set bigger and bigger goals. But you don't start lifting 200 pounds the first day at the gym. And you don't start with 8-year time frames. I started setting 30-day goals, then 3 months, then 6 months, then 1 year, then 2 years, then 4 years, and then 8 years. Every time I achieved the goal, I proved to myself that I could actually do this. And so I trained my mind to handle bigger and bigger goals, which is where the magic happens. Most people overestimate what they can achieve in 1 year, but they grossly underestimate how much they can achieve in 5 years. But you need to start with small goals on small time frames. And then build from there. But what I soon realized is that without the next lesson, no matter what goal I set, I would never reach it. In the beginning of my journey with elite sports, I would only ever measure my performance based on finish time or finish place. So did I improve my time or did I beat my competitors? Whenever I lost or did not hit my goal, I would absolutely hate myself. Then I would go home, work even harder, and the next time I went to a race, the anxiety and pressure was that much bigger. And I wish I knew sooner that there's a better way. Imagine every time you met a new challenge, you believed without a single doubt in your mind that you would crush it. How would that change your approach? Would you try more things? Do harder workouts? Would you accomplish more of your goals? This mindset is known as having a high self-efficacy, and it's one of the most powerful tools in a runner's tool belt. And the best part is, you can train it. So here's the secret for you. I build higher self-efficacy by measuring more things. Instead of just looking at race time, look at running form. How much running you did last week versus this week, how you've improved your breathing, how you've improved your recovery. The possibilities are endless. The more things you measure, the more ways you can win, and the more you can build that self-efficacy. If your time is worse, it doesn't matter because your recovery is better. This mental shift will build confidence and help you keep going. And if you combine that with the next lesson, you'll be unstoppable. After my second ever running race, I sat down like you do to look at the pictures. I wanted to see how cool I looked because I felt like I was running like a pro. But when I stared at that photo, I thought to myself, who is that guy? It looked terrible. My hands were weak, my hips were pointed to one side, and it looked nothing like it did in my head. The hard lesson I learned is that feeling you do something and actually doing it are two completely different things. And to bridge that gap, you need to work on your coordination and your motor skills, which means that you need to film yourself or get a coach and get some feedback to make sure that what you think you're doing is what you're actually doing. Then you need to work on being able to mirror what you see or hear. The better your motor control, the easier it will be to make adjustments and the faster you'll run. So that begs the question, how do we run most effectively? I'll teach you exactly how in this video right here.